Okay, so in the last lecture, we left Nietzsche asking, under what conditions did man invent for himself those values, judgments, good and evil, and what value do they inherently possess? And notice, Nietzsche asks, what conditions did man invent for himself those value judgments? So Nietzsche is drawing our attention to the fact that values serve purposes for us. They don't, contra natural law theorists or natural rights theorists, think that morals exist out there and they precede humans. No, for Nietzsche, morality is constructed for us and by us, or at least for some people, and we'll get to why. Now, here's a big quote that I want to read out from the Genealogy of Morals, which I think sets the scene quite nicely. In the preface, Nietzsche says, "We need a critique of moral values. The value of these values is for the first time to be called into question, and for this purpose a knowledge is necessary of the conditions and circumstances out of which these values grew, and under which they experienced their evolution and their distortion. The value of these values was taken for granted as an indisputable fact, which was beyond all question. No one has, up to the present, exhibited the faintest doubt or hesitation in judging the good man to be of a higher value than the evil man, of a higher value with regard specifically to human progress, utility, and prosperity generally, not forgetting the future. What? Suppose the converse were the truth." So Nietzsche's drawing our attention to the fact that we kind of presume that the good is the antithesis or the opposite to evil. Why is evil not good? Are there no benefits that are drawn from evil? Is there no ill health or problem that is gained from goodness? And so he starts the genealogy just with this question, maybe we should think about this. And let's work through where these values have come from in order to understand what they might mean. So his basic argument can be presented like this. All values themselves have values. And these values are to be located outside the value itself, right? Always in relationship to other values. So there is there's a network of values that are all related to each other, and it's just a question of drawing out the history of those. The question to ask is, why is it that we think some values are valuable and some values are not? Is there any history to the assumptions behind those questions? So for Deleuze, Nietzsche then has two struggles that he works against. The first one is a struggle against those who remove values from criticism. One of these people would be Kant, and he says that the categorical imperative, that which is a maxim that can be universalized, is a priori of any situation necessarily good, right? By virtue of the fact that it's a categorical imperative, and we saw why that was the case last week. But that's not a criticism. That's just a dogma. That's just a religious faith. Why universal? Number two, those who derive values from simple objective facts, like utilitarians. And don't forget, so according to ethical hedonism or ethical egoism, the fact that humans pursue pleasure makes it a good and makes it worthy of being pursued. And Nietzsche goes, just because we happen to want happiness sometimes, why does that make it a good? Some people desire war sometimes, some people desire their own death sometimes. Does that make those things good? No, not necessarily. This is his way of saying, well, that's a naturalist fallacy, isn't it? So what Nietzsche does in the Genealogy of Morals is define or derive two moral assessments. He looks back in history and he says, broadly, there have been two ways of understanding the difference between good and its opposite. And the first one is an assessment where good is the opposite of bad, right? So you get good and bad as like the opposites of each other. And he says this happened way back in ancient Greece, and it went right the way through up until about, but really still including, the Enlightenment period. So really right up until modernity. And according to this moral assessment, the good was invented by the powerful, and it was internalized as a property of the powerful, right? So the good, the powerful people, they looked at the world and they looked at themselves and they said, well, I'm happy, this is good. I'm surrounded by good things because I'm a good person. So it must be that the things that I have and my properties are good. And therefore anyone who doesn't have those properties must be bad. So bad rather, becomes the negation or the opposite of good. So for example, these elitists, they might be the moral egoists, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, who say, well, that which is good is that which I pursue. I pursue happiness, and therefore people who pursue happiness are good people, and people who do not pursue happiness are bad people. Natural law thinkers, Aristotle, Aquinas, well, I have identified certain laws that I believe exist by virtue of that fact that we are humans and designed by God. I orientate myself to those natural laws, and so I am good. And so anyone else who does not orientate themselves to those laws must be bad. Or number 3, deontological thinkers like Kant, I can deduce that there are certain a priori goods that exist. And because I orientate myself to these a priori goods, I am a good person. And anyone who does not orientate themselves to an a priori good is a bad person. So this becomes self-referential, okay? And of course, it cannot be that we are all excellent, because that would not allow these powerful people to feel like they naturally deserved their high up place in life, right? And you'll find in a lot of sort of, at least aristocratic writing, a sort of self-justification of their own position. Aristotle and Plato wrote of this in their political philosophies. Certainly Aristotle was very condemnatory of pretty much all forms of regime type, monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, even sometimes democracies, for self-justifying their own virtues. So there's a well-born assumption that the good are the happy ones and everyone else therefore cannot be. And in English, the phrase do well, you sometimes hear people say as a goodbye, oh, do well, comes from the assumption that action is associated with happiness, right? The good and the successful have got there by virtue of their action. And that the slothful, or people who rest, are not good, because, they've not done well. Nietzsche calls this phenomenon the pathos of nobility and distance. The idea that the nobility, the noble classes are good, they internalize this goodness, justify it, and they establish a distance between themselves and everyone else who is bad. And sometimes that badness is internalized by the people who are bad as well. So what do we mean? Who are these sorts of people who might do this? Well, here we have a Spartan hoplite, a warrior caste in ancient Greece. They had a militaristic society that foregrounded bravery and courage and military discipline, over and above weakness and feelings and blah, 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 right? So well known to have killed their children if they were not very, very strong from, at a very early age. Big slave population, etc., etc., etc. But from that, they characterize themselves as good, strength, blah, 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 in order to self-justify their practice, and everything else was weak. And as a result, we have this notion coming through Greek thought that strength is a virtue, and the weak weakness is not. Okay? What else? Well, this is Britney Spears in the music video to Baby One More Time. Now, Britney Spears, when I was a teenager, was an idol, and imbued, certainly for girls, all of the virtuosic sort of tendencies that girls would later aspire to. So, she was polite, and she was presumably fairly okay schoolgirl, but she sort of maybe rolled her skirt up a little bit, but not too much, showing a bit of belly, so a little bit rebellious. But in other words, like a good law-abiding citizen, so just sort of fitting in, just like establishing her own identity at the time. And this carries on throughout history, so that, people want to broadly fall in line, but to establish a certain identity for themselves. This is one of the original images of what we call today identity politics, at least not in feminist or post-colonial studies. How about the Queen? Right, again, so the idea of monarchies originally came from the idea that monarchs came from God, and the king was the voice of God, the very embodiment of God on the planet. Still the case with the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. And because they were the voice and the embodiment of God, they were very austere, they were very wealthy, they were distanced, literally distanced from the population, and they were waited on, right? So if you were all of these things, waited on, wealthy, distanced from the population, you yourself were good. And if you were not distanced from the population, if you didn't hold yourself to high esteem, if you weren't white, then you weren't a good person. And lastly, Bill Gates. Bill Gates is lauded at the moment for his charity work. Former CEO of Microsoft, helped develop it to an enormous corporation, American corporation, creator of things like Windows operating system and stuff like that, and now runs a charity. He's a philanthropist, using the billions and billions of pounds that he earned and has still invested to sort of spread the wealth out. And so he sees him as a good person. He joins the club of other ultra wealthy philanthropists who sort of hand out their money where they happen to see fit. They practice good acts like philanthropy, they internalize it, and everyone else who cannot practice philanthropy or earn a ton of money is by definition bad. I mean, one obvious problem with such high levels of philanthropy is that in order to get his wealth, he had to extract it from the workers that were working in the factories making the CDs and programming his operating system in the first place. So he might be giving out a bunch of money now, but he's also already extracted that from a group of people already. So Nietzsche's point here, or were he around the argument that he would no doubt use, is that these are a group of nobles who self-declared their virtues as being good, and we all kind of agree with that, and we've internalized this difference. Okay. So he carries on in the Genealogy of Morals to say this. He coins it with this phrase. He says, "Much rather has it been the good themselves, that is, the aristocratic, the powerful, the high-stationed, the high-minded, who have felt that they themselves were good and that their actions were good. That is to say, of the first order, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, the vulgar, the plebeian. It was out of this pathos of distance that they first arrogated the right to create values for their own profit and to coin the names of such values." One value today might be profit. Okay, so good, bad. The second moral assessment is the good-evil assessment. Now, this emerged for Nietzsche from the good-bad assessment. And here they mean different words, right? So it was bad, now it's evil. And evil involves doing damage or harming the interests of others. So it's not having a set of extrinsic qualities, it's the practice or the desire to do bad or to do wrong to other people's interests. Whereas goodness is the idea here of having altruistic concern for others, so doing well for other people. And he says that this has to be universally accepted around certainly the country, the society, if not the world. For it to work, has to be adopted, and so this is particularly suited to natural human rights talk, he says, and he lays the blame here, sort of at Kant, but really here he's looking at Christianity, and he's got throughout his work he takes a big sort of aim at Christianity. Not for the belief in a God. He's not particularly interested in the factual claims about whether or not God does exist, but at the sort of teaching that priests give at the pulpit and the moral philosophy that they give out. So when I talk about his criticism of Christianity, that's what I mean. And I should say here that, of course, it's not to say that all priests do this. When he criticised priests, and he does that a lot in the Genealogy of Morals, we shouldn't say that means he's criticising all priests. He's criticising that which is priestly, and he's defining priestliness in a particular way, and he's saying, well, that's problematic. So if a priest acts in that particular way, that would be a problem, and if they don't, it's not necessary. There's less of a problem. Okay. So, as opposed to having the extrinsic characteristics of good or bad, we have here the intrinsic characteristics of good or evil, either supporting somebody altruistically or condemning them and doing damage to their interests. And he says we make the mistake of conflating and confusing these things all the time, right now today, but we shouldn't. And here's why. It's because the good-evil assessment stems from the good-bad assessment. Whereas the good-bad assessment is what he calls a noble morality. That comes from the nobles. The good-evil morality comes from slaves. He calls it a slave morality. What happens, he said, is that over the last few hundred years, as a result of living under a noble morality, everyone else starts to build up what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. We could just call this resentment, but it's a particular kind of resentment for the status and the power and really the self-gratifying grandeur that noble people arrogate for themselves, develop for themselves. So we begin to build up a sort of condemnation of the nobles, of the goods in the good and bad, assuming, because we're all the bads, everyone else is just the bad. So the bads in the good and bad build up a resentment of the goods. And they build up their own moral philosophy, right? So the good-evil assessment comes from the sort of underclass of people. And what we start to do is we start to say, well, hang on, like these good people, these nobles, they've been wanting to keep us down, to push us down all of our lives. They wanted to keep us poor, tell us that we're bad in order to keep themselves rich and to self-justify their goodness. He says, right, this good-bad thing, we know it. We see it all the time. And resentment sets in. And so what happens is we start to look at everybody in this same light. Anyone who is showing the slightest bit of exceptionalism or specialness or power begins to be condemnable. We're a bit suspicious of it, right? It's the morality of a slave who feels resentful to their master, except in this case, they're resentful to anyone who shows individuality. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because this slave morality means that we no longer strive to develop ourselves as a humanity. We're no longer looking for excellence. We're no longer looking to be powerful, both in our own nature and over the environment or over our challenges. What we do, whereas good and bad morality creates an exclusive club of the good as opposed to the bad, good or an evil morality, it just builds resentment against anyone who excels or differs. And the reason why is because that shows just how weak everybody else is, right? If somebody else succeeds, it means that we're not succeeding, we're failing by comparison. And so Nietzsche says, I mean, this is understandable, but we need to go beyond it. And so his book, Beyond Good and Evil, is his attempt to say how we might do that. Now, we're going to stay on the genealogy of morals because delving into Beyond Good and Evil would I think, become too specialised, and we'd have to spend another time doing that. But look, Nietzsche coins this problem with this other quote. He says, "In the dwarfing and levelling of the European man lurks our greatest peril, for it is this outlook which fatigues. We see today nothing which wishes to be greater. We surmise that the process is always still backwards towards something more attenuated, more inoffensive, more cunning, more comfortable, more mediocre, more indifferent, more Chinese, more Christian. Man, there is no doubt about it, grows always better. The destiny of Europe lies even in this, that in losing the fear of man, we have also lost the hope in man. Yea, the will to be man. The sight of man now fatigues. What is present-day nihilism if it is not that? We are tired of man." What this really amounts to is a denial of our own nature. He says, you saw in the previous quote, mankind is always getting better. We always do it. But what happens is that we begin to resent the fact that we are getting better. And when we see betterment in other people, we want to just sort of smack it back down. We might fetishize this betterment, right? We see it on our TV screens. We see shining celebrities that look, wow, amazing. But they're kind of make-believe. We can see them in glossy rag mags. And as the Harry and Meghan interview showed, as soon as they start to speak out, the newspapers and the media condemn them immediately because, they're now bringing reality into our lives. As long as they're a spectacle that we can look at and we don't actually have to think of them as really existing people, that's safe. But as soon as they become real, we slap them back down. So this is, for Nietzsche, a denial of our human nature, of what it is to be mankind. And he's got these two beautiful images in the Genealogy of Morals, which I'll just read. The first one is, I think it's great. "It is not surprising that the lambs should bear a grudge against the great birds of prey, but that is no reason for blaming the great birds of prey for taking the little lambs." And he continues a bit later, "To require of strength that it should not express itself as strength, that it should not be a wish to overpower, a wish to overthrow, a wish to become master, a thirst for enemies and antagonisms and triumphs, is just as absurd as to require of weakness that it should express itself as strength." So what he's saying here is that it's not only unfair, but it's pretty problematic to expect the strong to be weak, just like you wouldn't expect somebody who is weaker to all of a sudden be strong, would you? They're just two orders of power that are expressing themselves. And the resentment of the strong is denying the nature of the strong. He says, and this is the other beautiful bit of imagery, he says that we make a mistake when we say a flash of lightning, right? We say a lightning flashes. Lightning doesn't flash. Lightning is the flash. If there is no flash, there is no lightning. And in the same way, we sort of see exhibitions of strength as the representation of a potential strength, right? A sort of latent strength. And that latent strength that's sort of lying there, we kind of tolerate that. You know, we kind of want people to be, we call it today resilient. But as soon as they demonstrate that they are strong, as soon as we have this beautiful flash of lightning, we go, well, hang on. Well, no, you're not allowed to show that and demonstrate that you're stronger than us. You have to be part of us. You have to be one of us. You have to just pull it back a little bit. So this is the problem with these two forms of morality that Nietzsche basically accuses every previous form of morality as exhibiting. And what he wants is to suggest a form of morality that we can adopt, which embraces who we are, which really has a love for human nature and what we might become. That's not hostile to anybody else. That would be, again, a slave morality, right? To be necessarily antagonistic to anybody purely because you're strong, that wouldn't be strength. That would be giving in to your inner desires. But nevertheless, a way of embracing strength and individuality and love for life without repressing it through some form of resentment. And that's what we'll get to in the next lecture.